I'm just going to cover some updates on House Bill 3, and then cover a little bit of the ESSER 2910, or excuse me, 2019-20, the whole harmless and the interaction with the ADA and everything, and then open it up for questions. So if at any time you all have questions, feel free to stop me, or you can also wait towards the end. So right here, what we have here, this is a slide that Commissioner presented. A lot of these slides are come from a presentation we presented to Senate Ed. And so the numbers here are from the perspective of the state. So when you see a number in red, that means it costs the state a little bit more money than what the state had initially estimated. Okay, so you see a number going up and it's in red, it's from the perspective of the state. And so House Bill 3, when we did the runs back in the session, we had estimated that there was going to be an average gain per ADA of over $635 per ADA. In year one, that ended up being closer to around $530. And the main reason for that is during the session, comptroller had projected somewhere around roughly around 6% value growth, just under 6% value growth. And in actuality, when we got the real property values, values grew by over 10%. And so, as you know, in the old system prior to House Bill 3, there was this concept of lag money, right? So if your property values grew a ton or more than they did the year before, you got to keep the difference, and the formulas never really caught up with that. And so because of that 10% statewide value growth, a lot of districts that weren't previously projected to have formula transition grant suddenly had formula transition grant because their old law revenue targets went up substantially. So the difference between House Bill 3 and old law shrunk, relatively speaking. Decrease in recapture. The recapture did decrease, but the amount of the decrease was slightly less. That mainly had to do again with the same thing with the property values growing so much faster. More property value growth equals more recapture. Mainstream weight increase. The legislature did increase the mainstream weight from 1.1 to 1.15. And so that our estimates were right in line with what we projected that to cost. And even with accounting for enrollment growth, that was still right tracking pretty closely. Same thing with dyslexia allotments. This slide is from earlier in the fall, and to my knowledge, I think there's some districts that are resubmitting some of their dyslexia counts, and so actually that 136 million might end up increasing slightly, but even with that, that was a pretty close estimate. Comp Ed was really spot on given the level of the amounts of the allotment at over 5 billion. Even with all the 5 new tiers of the tiered weights, the projections from the session held pretty closely when we got the actual data. So that was good. It's always good to have good estimates. Dual language allotment, that one specifically for the increased weights of the 0.15 weight for English language learners in dual language programs, and then the additional 0.05 weight for native English speakers in those programs, did not come in as high as we had projected. And so we're not sure if that's because maybe it was going to take a little longer for districts to implement dual language programs effectively. And so maybe there wasn't a huge, driving increase the first year, but I expect that over the next three years that would continue to rise, and as more districts take advantage of those programs and the additional funding offered by that. Early education allotments, we did notice a slight downtick in the growth rate of K-3 enrollments, lower than what we had projected. So that could be due to a number of factors. It could be due to lower birth rates, or different migration patterns in and out of the state for various reasons. So that was one of the things we did notice. Fast growth allotment did increase over what we had projected. That one, that's based on the 3-year rolling average of attendance counts, and once we got an updated information for the most recent year, that kicked a few more districts into that allotment, or I should say a few larger districts into that allotment that generated a slight increase in cost. Teacher incentive allotment was down a little bit from what we had projected. A lot of that I think had to do with COVID-19, is what our team was informed by districts that were interested in doing that program, but for COVID-19 kind of just slowing that down. So we anticipate over the next few years that'll tick back up, back on projections. Transportation allotment decreased significantly, but that primarily due to the COVID closures that happened in spring break 2020. Formula transition grant, again, the main driving force behind that growing by more than 10 times the initial estimate was the property value growth and the lag money driving the old formula. So for those of you on formula transition that weren't projected to be there, I'm guessing one possible reason would be you had strong value growth in your district. So here's just some of those highlights. One thing I'll focus on just to refresh everyone's memory. Some of the main things, the school finance things in House Bill 3, funding equity, focused on comp ed funding, redid the treatment of the ASF, and on the lower right hand side also a focus from House Bill 3 on reducing recapture and property taxes. Tax rates dropped around an average of 8 cents in year one, and we anticipate that they'll continue to drop. And I have a slide that shows that later on. And of course, recapture was cut significantly. So even with the decrease in recapture, even with the decrease of recapture, without House Bill 3, recapture would have been close to 4 billion last year. So House Bill 3 did its job in reducing recapture as a method of financing the FSP. Here is a high level snapshot of what House Bill 3 did for districts in terms of new revenue. So this is running essentially 1920 with and without House Bill 3. So on the left, you have what the House Bill 3 would have been, or what school finance would have been without House Bill 3. On the right, you have post House Bill 3. So you can see nearly $5 billion increase in state funds. Local property tax collections decreased 2.2 billion, even with the 10% value growth. There was still a decrease in local funds. Again, recapture had a reduction with a net overall increase of about 2.7 billion for public education in 2020. This next slide shows a very similar comparison, but instead it looks at 2019 versus 2020. So this is more what you all would experience, or what you would look at year over year changes in revenue in terms of what was actually new revenue into your budget. So in 2018-19 versus 2019-20, there was over a $4 billion increase, $4.4 billion increase in year over year funding. And if you actually computed on a per ADA gain, that was nearly $900 per ADA. And so when you look at year over year, that's remarkable. Again, the previous slide doesn't look as dramatic, but primarily that's because of that huge 10% value growth that made essentially what would have been old law look better relative to House Bill 3. So one of the new things, we've done a lot of presentations over the last couple of years. And so one of the, I won't go through all the allotments in House Bill 3. We have a lot of presentations on the TA website. I did want to draw attention to a few things that that at least my team doesn't talk about often. The teacher mentor program allotment, that one, is something that the commissioner has discretion to adopt rules on. And so in August 2020, we had about 67 districts that were approved to receive the allotment for this school year that we're in. And it's about $1,800 per mentee, and that can be used for a number of different things. There's rules that have been published. This allotment's not administered by my team. So if you have questions, certainly I can direct you to the right staff at TEA for those questions. But we're not the ones administering that. But if you are looking for a new source of new money, this would be one program to consider. And I believe it would have good impacts on student learning as they try to grow their profession of teaching and learning. Teacher incentive allotment, I just kind of wanted to summarize in year one what it looked like. So we had 26 districts that were part of the first cohort for the TIA. We distributed roughly about $40 million that represented the allotments for over 3,600 teachers across the state. And we did deliver that as part of Settle Up. And down below, you see on the slide, you see the breakdown of the different allotments by the three different categories or designations of those teachers, and then their potential earning amount depending on how the districts choose to distribute those funds. CCMR was one of the things in House Bill 3 that was new, in that it was actually funding for performance, right? So this one, again, this is another allotment that's not administered by state funding. But this, one of the things on CCMR is that it does require school districts and charter schools to adopt CCMR readiness plans, post on their website. And again, because of COVID, those goals and progress measures will be extended to the end of this month. I believe they were due earlier, but because of COVID, I believe TEA is extending that deadline there. And so if you want more information, again, you can reach out to me and I can put you in charge for the people in charge of CCMR. Outcomes bonus for this year and CT expansion was another big thing. CCMR outcome bonus delivered around $225 million. The commission rules were expected should be finalized sometime last fall. And then of course CTE did add new funding for tech apps, as well as additional P-Tech and U-Tech models and expansion into 7th grade. So right here, again, one of the things that House Bill 3 did, which I think was great, was adding reimbursement, a one-time reimbursement for SAT, ACT tests, as well as for certification or industry-based credential testing. So right now we're projecting about 20 million for the first one and around 12 million for the second certification reimbursement. And final amounts will be calculated at final settle up. So in a few months when we do final at April 2021. Special ed, again, the weight increased by 1.1 to 1.15 billion, or excuse me, 1.1 to 1.15. And so that did deliver additional funding into special education. And that was right on track. One of the things that the House Bill 3 did was create the Special Education Advisory Committee. And that committee put together a series of recommendations over the summer for the legislature to consider for revising special education on a greater scale. So that's something to look for during the session. Additional day school year. So this is one avenue for new money for school districts. House Bill 3 adds funding supports for any school system that wants to add more days beyond the minimum 180 days. And so right now, we don't know the cost for 21 because we need to wait till the end of the year to see which districts actually participated and then how many days they delivered above the minimum 180. But essentially what this program does is districts have the option to get for up to additional 30 half days of funding for any campus or campuses that choose to participate. One of the requirements is that you need to do this for you need to have a minimum of 180 days, and of course the minimum 75,600 minutes for those campuses. Comp Ed spectrum. I won't spend a lot of time on Comp Ed. I believe you all probably have seen this slide numerous times over the last 18 months. But again, the Comp Ed funding is right on track, just over $5 billion. For reference, old law Comp Ed was roughly around 4. So House Bill 3 did deliver an additional, essentially 20% or more of Comp Ed funding. And so that really showed the commitment the legislature had towards funding students that were economically disadvantaged. Fast growth allotment, that was a rule that we did to clarify some things in statute. And so again, there's about 300 million in fast growth allotment with a weight of 0.04 for each student in each of those districts. And that's essentially those districts that are in the top quartile of student growth statewide. And so this is one of the allotments I think you could see, or you could expect some tweaking on this allotment. There were a number of districts that either missed the cutoff or they were fast growing, and they felt that the methodology in statute and in rule could be slightly better tailored to give a little more money towards the districts that were growing faster. So I could see this one allotment being tweaked this session. And I want to talk about, I'm going to pivot a little bit to M&O taxes real quick. Just a refresher, I don't know who's in the audience and who may be new to school finance, but prior to House Bill 3, And the system was based on a dollar tax rate for tier one, and then there were 17 pennies of enrichment. The first 6 pennies, golden pennies, the next 11 pennies were copper pennies. Of course, the up to $1.04, or the first 4 golden pennies, you could access with a board action without a voter election. The next 2 pennies required a voter election, or TRE, is what it was formerly known as. House Bill 3 did a number of things with compression. So in year one, compressed tier one tax rate from a dollar to 0.93 or 7%. It essentially compressed copper pennies by the ratio of the increase in the basic allotment, so roughly cutting them in half. And then you had golden pennies expanding into 8. So for year one, or last year, the maximum rate was 1.0683, and then most districts went to 97 cents. They took those 4 free golden pennies again. And then this year is now when we have what I talked about before with state compression. What we're talking about this year is a hybrid of state compression and local compression. And so state compression pushed down the state MCR from 0.93 to 0.9164. And then it established also, when the House Bill 3 introduced a local compression into the mix, it established what we call a 10% equity band. So essentially, no district can go below 90% of the highest MCR. And so the equity band there, the lowest rate is 0.8247. And so because of that, we no longer have one uniform maximum total rate. So before, prior to House Bill 3, the maximum rate was $1.17. And now each district's maximum rate is going to vary depending on where their particular MCR is. And so in this example, we have 0.9164 plus 8 pennies. And then the difference for this particular district, let's say if they were at 0.9164, their maximum rate could be 1.0864. However, their district, the maximum rate without a voter approval tax rate election is 1.0547. And so that has to do with the number of pennies that were available last year, and the conversion, or as the pennies slid down. And so it's basically taking the MCR 0.9164, taking the previous number of copper pennies that were available from the previous slide, and then adding that. And so that's how you get to that 1.0547. Here's a summary of MCRs, or actually total MNO rates, are primarily driven by MCR changes. We actually don't have tax rates yet. TA, we're going to get those in the next couple of weeks from the comptroller's office. But we did do a property value survey in order to calculate MCRs for districts in the summer. And so based on self-reported local value growth information, values grew around 4%. And so that drove a tax rate decrease by an average of 3.7 cents. Of course, that doesn't take into account whether any districts went out for that 5th additional penny or went out for voter elections. But right now, given the data that we have, that's what it looks like the MCR, or at least that's what local compression did prior to any districts taking additional action. One thing just reminding people, any district considering local tax increases, the efficiency audits are now part of that deal. LBB put out guidelines for that, and essentially you have to select the auditor at least 4 months prior to the tax increase date, and then you need to post that audit related to the efficiency audit at least 30 days prior to the election. So for those of you considering elections next year, you keep that in mind. You need to account for the timeline related to efficiency audits. And again, we won't know how many districts went out for tier 2 pennies or additional pennies until next month. And so here is just where you can go to find everything you need to know about House Bill 3. There's a ton of information on that page. There's PowerPoints, there's videos, there's spreadsheets and additional materials. So I strongly encourage, if you haven't been there ever, to go there. If you haven't been there in a while, go there from time to time to check for new materials. It gets updated from time to time. Lastly, I did want to spend some time talking about what happened last year with the hold harmless and with the CARES ESSER interaction. We've been getting a lot of questions throughout the summer, and even I was on the phone with a district yesterday. They couldn't understand how the interaction with the ESSER resulted in a reduction of ADA for their district. So even now in January, 5 months after settle up, I think, and then I think Connie mentioned that she had gotten some questions on this, so I did want to spend some time talking about it. So I'll talk about high level state, what it looked like, and then just talk about just some examples as how you would think about that in your as it relates to your particular district. So last year, the state hold harmless cost the state nearly $13 billion, and so the way we're calculating that is, as you know, by statute, and prior to this year, with our special rules for remote instruction. The FSP is driven by attendance, in-person on-campus attendance. There are some exceptions for Texas VSN, but generally speaking, the system is driven by students showing up, on a physical location for districts. And so when campuses and districts and charters shut down around spring break last year, essentially we only had roughly a little more than about 4 6 weeks worth of in-person instruction. And so, if TEA were to have implemented the statute literally, there would not have been any funding generated for the last part of the school year, when districts closed and never reopened. And so, obviously, we weren't. The commissioner wasn't going to do that. I wanted to preserve district budgets and teacher jobs and everything, and try to continue and help support you all, get the students continuing to learn somehow through the end of last year. But that said, those 2 6 weeks technically weren't eligible for funding. And so, what we did is we funded a whole harmless. So we did that. And then ESSER funding from CARES Act became available, and we took a little more than $1 billion to help us fund that whole harmless. So I know a lot of districts were disappointed that it wasn't $1 billion on top of the FSP, but there was a reason for that. The state chose to take that to help fund that in order to preserve as much money for the next session, to try to minimize and prevent cuts to FSP in the future. And so that was the principle behind that decision. And I know, again, there's going to be some people out there that weren't happy about that, but that's what happened. And so, in order to actually implement that method of finance swap with ESSER funds, what the state did is we first loaded what we would call a run without the whole harmless. And so, there's a run out there, late August, early September, where if you look at the statewide totals, the state aid drops from 22 billion to 12.3 billion. Recapture doubles, nearly 5 billion in recapture. That's the run, that's what districts would have been funded on without the whole harmless. A few runs later, you'll see, we then calculate the whole harmless based on historical data, and put back districts to what we think they would have been without COVID. So we looked at the enrollment from fall 2019. We looked at ADA and FTE ratios to enrollment from 2018-19. We applied those ratios to 2020, and then we restored FSP with the whole harmless. And so you can see the green bar there, state aid 22.6 billion, and that's just foundation school fund. That doesn't include available school fund or IFA or EDA. Recapture gets back down to 2.5 billion or so. And then a few runs after that, you will see a run for your particular district where the ADA decreases slightly. And so what we did is we took the amount for each district in charter school, we got from the Division of Grants and Administration the amount of the ESSER funds, or the ESSER allotment, for that year for each district. And then we reduced ADA for those districts by an amount necessary to reduce FSP net state and local funding by an amount equal to or very close to the ESSER grants. It's a very complicated process. So there's, for some districts, we didn't quite get their dollar for dollar, but for 98-99% of the districts, we got within a few dollars worth. And then so what you see in now the current SOF runs, you see a reduction in state aid and a slight increase in recapture, because you're supposed to take essentially the SOF, combine it with your ESSER funds, and then that should get you back to where you were in the green bar. So if you were to look at your particular district and track those runs that happened late August, early September, that's what you would find. And so it's important to remember that the ADA on the summary finance now, again, is not what you reported to PEMS, and it's not even the whole harmless ADA that the state delivered. But you can think of it as it's the whole harmless ADA that the state held you harmless to, minus your ESSER allotment or your ESSER portion essentially. And so that's kind of high level how it worked. I expect that there's still questions, and now I can open it up for questions if there are any. And I think I see something in the chat there, so maybe. Okay, let's see what we have here. Does TEA need to prove the auditors for the efficiency audits? I don't think so. Honestly, it's been a while since I reviewed that part of the statute, but I believe since LBV is putting out the guidelines, you should go to the LBV website and read those guidelines, download the guidelines, and just follow them. Typically, I think what we've told districts, and David can chime in later when he's talking, could confirm or elaborate or correct me. But typically, it tends to be your current independent auditor, because they already kind of have this relationship with you all, and it might be easier for them to do it. And so I think the districts that have chosen to go this route, I think at least anecdotally that they've chosen to use their current external auditor for that. Okay, next question. What are TEA's plans on ESSER 2? Are they considering letting district keep some of it, not through the FSP? So I don't administer ESSER 2. Again, that's a division of Corey Green runs that shop. Right now, those decisions haven't been finalized, and so I would stay tuned. I think we're still learning about everything having to do with ESSER, and I know that's something that you can probably expect communication on TEA very soon in terms of what the ESSER allotments are going to be, the timing of the drawdown of the funds, when they're available, and then if there is going to be some sort of FSP offset like there was in 1920, then we would of course communicate that as soon as that decision had been made. Let's see. Okay, this one just looks like a comment run. 29015 was right before the ESSER reduction. Yes, that number does look familiar to me, so that seems right. There are a few runs in between. We had to do some corrections for formula transition grant, but I believe 29015 is the correct run to look at, or right around there. And let's see, next question. Will TEA consider extending the whole harmless ADA in the future? So I presume you're talking about the current school year 2020-2021. So that is something that TEA is considering. And it's kind of like what we've always told districts: don't expect or don't count on that. But the commissioner is very data driven, and we need to wait for more data. And so in the spring, as we get more data about enrollment, about comp ed, about property values, about what it's looking like in districts, what the state budget's looking like, that's something that could be on the table. Again, we're in session now, and so that decision if that decision were to be made, obviously would, that's something that the legislature could also weigh in on, or would weigh in on. So I'd say nothing's really changed in that regard, in that I've maintained since July that, and that the whole harmless that's announced is what you should count on. And then later on in the fall, when we did expand it to the third 6 weeks, I did reiterate that while that had been expanded to the third 6 weeks, that doesn't necessarily guarantee future expansion. So I would not plan for it. But again, the commissioner's never really changed his position. It's don't count on it, and as more data becomes available, we would consider it if it was deemed appropriate, and if the the state had funds to do so. Okay, when is the deadline to ask for the whole harmless for the third 6 weeks? I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that. We can definitely get an answer for you, Jamie, or if Connie, if you want to make sure, circle back with me that I get that question answered. You can reach out in the meantime to Waiver Division. They're the ones that would be dealing with all that, but we'll try to get an answer for you today. I'm sure I can find an answer today.
I believe it's May 1st.
Is it May 1st? Okay, great, thank you. Okay, next question. Is ESSER2 the same funding as CRRSA? You know, I'm still learning about ESSER2 and CRRSA. Again, that's all federal funds. I've been really busy with session with modeling school finance builds and dealing with FSP. And so, I would defer to someone else to answer that question in terms of what the acronyms are and whether one's a subset of the other or not. I'm still wrapping my heads around it when I have time.
Thanks,
Are
Josh.
there are
The
there any? Yes, thank you. Yeah, thanks, Josh, for that. Any other questions related to this or state funding in general, or anything about the summary finances? I can try to answer those as well.
I know you mentioned, Leo, folks still trying to wrap their head around all this. And I know I'm going to share some of the comments, or at least a few comments that I heard during the time related to ESSER. In
Hmm.
terms of the distribution was based on, if I remember correctly, Title I regular uh,
Yes.
distribution. And so I did hear from districts saying, if you calculate that out, I mean, some of us are getting these dollars instead of state dollars that we already had coming to us. And other districts that had a lot less or would have a lot less Title I regular, they were still pretty much complete or made whole with just state dollars. So hopefully in the second round of this, folks at TA, whoever all those folks are, can consider that, in terms of really the dollars may have been the same, but it was a makeup of state versus federal and grabbing back and forth. And I mean, some of our CFOs and assistant soups, and I'm sure it wasn't just Region 1, it was across the state, thinking there's got to be a better way. There's got to be a better way to do these calculations. I have heard, and I'm sure all of you have too, that there are over 80 legislators, I think, asking for the hold harmless to continue 4 through 6 weeks. So hopefully, but that would be something that hopefully folks move on pretty quickly, because we've got several of our districts, maybe up to half now, that are June 30th year ends. And I know across the state, obviously hundreds of them June 30th. So decisions being made in terms of hold harmless. But again, and I don't see any more chats or comments, but like I say, there were
There's
some.
one more question,
Oh, okay, let me take a look.
but go ahead and finish. I think we still have some time then.
Well, actually, we can go to the question based on comptroller's revenue estimate for new biennium. Is it looking like FSP will not decline? If so, can we budget based on current basic allotment dollars and current weights?
It's a very good question. So yeah, you're right. Based on I will say looking at the introduced budgets, not necessarily the revenue estimate, because the budgets have the revenue in the base budgets for both chambers don't match the revenue estimate put out by the comptroller. So um, there's that, but it is true that and I'm having a meeting later on today with LVP to go over the K-12 budget in the introduced budgets. I'd say that's I would hate to tell you all don't worry about potential cuts and don't even think that they could happen, because anything could happen. Um, so I would always encourage you to budget conservatively, but I'd say it is a good sign that the first introduced budget looks like FSP is not going to be cut. But again, that's not even really a surprise. I mean, legislators have been saying that since the spring and since the summer, and they've been consistent. Leadership has been consistent in saying that one of their goals is to preserve House Bill 3 funding. So that's not unexpected. That said, the session's just getting underway, and it's a long way to the end of May. So I would say keep a close watch, on revisions to the budget, and pay attention to the hearings, and the conversations in the House Appropriations, Senate Finance, and the two education committees. And in order for FSP really to decline, there would need to be a bill, right? You would really need to change statute, and so you know um, be on the lookout for that. So I would budget conservatively, um, but again, it's a good sign. But again, I'm not involved with setting the state budget, so I can't tell you what it's going to look like in May.